Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. Today we will be discussing the American Revolution. Before we do, I'd like to invite you to go to my website, my YouTube account, and look at the playlist of presidential videos that deals with all the presidents from George Washington through Obama, and of course including the Founding Fathers. But now back to the Revolution, let's begin. In North America, since the establishment of Jamestown in 1607, the colonists had very little interference from their mother country of England. The colonists in the New World were different. Many of them were Puritans, but they were all different from the citizens of Great Britain. They arrived on a frontier, untamed territory, cheap land. The New Englanders were self-sufficient. There was also an influx of people from Scotland, Germany, the Netherlands, and Ireland. They had assemblies, they had governors, the colonists had lawmakers that would take care of road building, repairs, and enforcement of law. England pretty much left the colonies alone. And these 13 British colonies were Connecticut, Delaware, Georgia, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, South Carolina, and Virginia. Things changed in 1763 when the English defeated the French in the French and Indian War. England needed money and decided to enforce an old series of laws named the Navigation Act that controlled the trade in the sea. British troops arrived to maintain order, and the Quarterly Act of 1765 meant that colonists were obligated to provide British troops with lodging, food, and transportation. That same year, the Stamp Act was passed, a law that required almost all documents to be stamped at a fee. Now, the colonists protested so strongly that the Stamp Act was repealed. More taxes followed, but then in 1773, British government decided to help the East India Company create a monopoly of Chinese tea. The tea could be brought from China and sold directly to the American colonists. This angered small American businesses that could not compete with this giant monopoly, the East India Company. Also, the East India Company was not paying any import tax, so the colonists were not getting any benefit out of this. So, American colonists, in anger and as a sign of protest, dressed up as Indians. They went to the Boston Harbor, climbed aboard some ships belonging to the East India Company, and took about, in today's currency, $500,000 of tea and dumped it into the harbor. In retaliation, Britain closed down the Boston Harbor. Colonists were ordered to seize opposition and to seize any other further acts of vandalism. The Charter of Massachusetts was rescinded, meaning that the self-sufficient government of Massachusetts and other colonies came to an end. Yet hostilities continued. In April of 1775, King George III of England ordered British troops to confiscate all the weapons in Concord, Massachusetts. Now, the colonists heard about it. Fighting broke out, and British troops in Lexington, who were on the way to Concord, got into a battle with the Minutemen, a group of soldiers that the colonists had put together. A third of the British troops were killed. Another battle followed at Bunker Hill. The colonists lost the Battle of Bunker Hill, but they held together impressively. This was the beginning of the War of the American Revolution. It was an emergency state. Representatives of all 13 colonies got together to discuss the coercive acts of England and what to do. This was a second Continental Congress. They had gotten together before, but now things were at a head. They couldn't agree. Many of the delegates did not want to break away from England. Other delegates wanted to break away completely and start an independent new government and country. A third group wanted to stay with England but have some semblance of independent activities. They did decide to put a boycott on all British goods. They wrote letters to King George III asking for clemency. Some of them thought that it was the Parliament that was influencing the king. They created their own currency and decided to have trade agreements with other countries. They made it clear that if they were going to pay taxes, they wanted to be represented in the Parliament. On June 14, 1775, the Continental Congress agreed that they had to have a Continental Army, and a commanding general was chosen, George Washington of Virginia. Washington had fought in the French and Indian War alongside the British. He was a commanding figure, 6 feet 2 inches tall, magnetic personality. A lot has been said and criticized of his lack of military experience and even failures to win many battles during the American Revolution. But he had a tremendous task before him. When the army was formed, many were extremely young or extremely old. Many had no training. Supplies were low. There was no navy. George Washington had to micromanage every aspect of this huge undertaking, an overwhelming task. He had to come up with a military plan, strategies. He had to select officers, train this bunch of ragtag troops, and create a chain of command. The Continental Congress sent letter after letter to King George III of Britain, but it became clear that the British government would not compromise. So little by little, the moderates slowly gave way to the radicals. And then Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced the motion to call for independence from Great Britain. Now, while Congress argued for or against this motion, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson were chosen to write a letter to King George III. This letter was a declaration of independence, and most of it was written by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia. Now, today it is considered a moral standard, a declaration of principles that we should strive to achieve. The declaration was read across the colonies, signed in 1776. And let's look at some of the words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This outstanding document was signed in 1776 by the delegates, and this is no small thing. If the colonists had lost the war, King George III would have had every single founding father who signed the document hung for treason. The war. It wasn't going well. Washington was chased out of Long Island all the way to Pennsylvania. It was humiliating. A harsh winter kicked in. And suddenly Washington decided that he had to make a bold move. So his troops crossed the Delaware River and captured Trenton, New Jersey. 900 prisoners were taken. Then they attacked and beat the British in Princeton. British General Howe devised a plan to capture Albany in order to control the Hudson River and cut off the top colonies from the middle and crush Washington and his troops. After more skirmishes and chasing and defeats, Washington's troops surrounded General Burgoyne in Saratoga. It was a tremendous victory for the colonists. They captured 5,700 British troops, but then came another harsh winter in Valley Forge. Men got sick, deserted, starved, and died. Washington was impressed by a young man who became his chief of staff, Alexander Hamilton. He would later establish the financial system of the United States and aid in creating the first national bank. He died in 1804, shot and killed in a duel with then Vice President Aaron Burr. A French nobleman crossed the ocean to help the American cause. His name was Marquis de Lafayette, and he would prove to be instrumental. John Paul Jones would help form the first American Navy and acquire many victories. Benedict Arnold, a respected American officer, betrayed George Washington, eventually defecting to the British side. He intended to give the British control of West Point, New York. Thankfully, his plan was discovered. But while all of this was going on, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin were able to charm the French, and they were successful in acquiring more and more aid from France. The French agreed to send more troops, more money, and more equipment. This was decisive. The British defeated the Americans decisively in Savannah, Charleston, and Camden. But then Marquis de Lafayette led an army and surrounded the British troops in Yorktown. George Washington rushed to join him with another army, and the French Navy arrived to trap the British in the peninsula, blocking the route by sea and by land. The British surrendered and the Americans won. And the war actually did drag on for another 2 years, but it was a foregone conclusion. The British had been defeated. George Washington gave an emotional farewell to his troops and retired to Mount Vernon. The first list of laws that were formed was not the Constitution of the United States, it was the Articles of Confederation. The problem with the Articles of Confederation is that it gave too much freedom to the states and there was no real central government. There were problems: food shortages, riots, debt. The North and South were already bumping heads over slavery. Nobody wanted to go back to having a monarchy, so a constitutional convention was formed to overhaul this system and to create a new one. And the person that was most responsible for the Constitution was the father of the Constitution himself, James Madison, who would later become President of the United States. The convention, led by James Madison, formed a system of checks and balances, three branches of government to hold each other accountable: the executive branch, the judicial, and the legislative. And George Washington was chosen to be the leader, the president of the executive branch, the first president of the United States. Later on, the Bill of Rights was introduced, a series of amendments to the Constitution guaranteeing the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and freedom of the press, among others. Founding fathers John Adams and Thomas Jefferson also became presidents of the United States. And interestingly, they both became friends and died on the exact same day, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. Founding fathers James Madison and James Monroe also became presidents of the United States. And the sixth president of the United States, Andrew Jackson, was a young man during the American Revolution. He fought as a teenager. Sadly, the Declaration of Independence and the statement that all men are created equal did not apply to everybody. African Americans remained slaves, despite the fact that some of the founding fathers were against slavery, and it was a huge argument during the Second Continental Congress. Native Americans that lived on the land were caught in the middle of this revolution and were forced to take sides. Many of them had their villages burnt down, and several of them became refugees across this new United States. Many women thought that this new republic and declaration that we were all equal would apply to them as well, but unfortunately they didn't acquire a voice. Women didn't get the vote until the 20th century. Despite these and other shortcomings, the world was watching this new form of government. Now, there had been small republics before, such as Switzerland or the Netherlands, but this was the first time a large nation established a republic where separate states organized themselves and gave up a little sovereignty so as to unite into one nation. This belief in limited power of government, written constitutions, and the symbol of the Declaration of Independence appealed to many people, especially the French. The French would soon have their own revolution, very bloody with far-reaching consequences that changed the landscape of Europe and brought about the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French Revolution. That's in the next video. But in the meantime, comment below, or better yet, subscribe. Thanks for watching. This is Cool Talk.